At midnight on February 28, 1943, 8 Japanese troop transports and 8 destroyers cleared the harbour entrance at Rabaul and formed into convoy order in the darkness of the Bismarck Sea. On the bridge of the destroyer Shirayuki, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura watched the navigation lights of his formation settle into position and said nothing. He already knew what the orders said about this mission. He already knew what the intelligence staff at Rabaul had calculated. Imperial General Headquarters had assessed that a convoy sailing the 800 miles from Rabaul to LAE in the conditions that now existed in the Southwest Pacific, with American air power concentrated at Port Moresby, with the 5th Air Force flying modified bombers that intelligence had not fully characterized, with Allied code-breaking providing days of advance notice of any convoy movement, could expect to lose approximately half of what it sailed with, half the transports, half the troops, half the men who were packed below decks on 8 ships in the darkness behind him, waiting for a voyage that their commanders had told them would be brief. 50% losses were expected and accepted. The orders said to sail. LAE had to be held. The New Guinea campaign could not survive without the men on those ships. Kimura sailed. 6,900 men were in the convoy that left Rabaul that night. 5,954 of them were aboard the 8 transports, distributed carefully and specifically across all 8 hulls, so that the loss of any single ship would not destroy the irreplaceable equipment of any single unit. The rest were distributed among the 8 destroyers of the escort. Aboard the destroyer, Tokitsukaze was Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the Japanese 18th Army, who had ordered this convoy because his forward positions in New Guinea were starving and sick and outnumbered and could not hold without the reinforcements these ships were carrying. Aboard the destroyer, Yukikaze was Lieutenant General Hidemitsu Nakano, commander of the 51st Division. The soldiers packed into the transports were his men. The division's equipment was split among all 8 hulls deliberately. The planners at Rabaul understood the mathematics of the mission. They distributed the cargo to minimize the cost of the mathematics they expected to pay. The men below decks knew less than the admirals on the bridges. They had been told the voyage was the final leg before battle. After months at Rabaul, waiting for weather and timing and orders, they were going to New Guinea to fight the Americans and the Australians, who were pressing the Japanese forward positions from the south. The 51st Division had originally been assigned to Wewak, a position further west along the coast of New Guinea. The deterioration of the situation at LAE had changed that. The men were told there was a new assignment. The reason for the change was not explained to them in terms that conveyed the urgency that had driven headquarters to redirect the division from a less dangerous route to this one. Men at the level of individual soldiers in the transport holds were told what the army told soldiers at that level. They were going where they were needed, and they were needed at LAE. The 8 transports were the Ayo Maru, the Kyokusei Maru, the Oigawa Maru, the Shinai Maru, the Taimei Maru, the Teiyo Maru, the Kembu Maru, which carried aviation fuel in drums rather than soldiers, and the Nojima, a special service vessel carrying 400 naval marines. The 6 army troopships between them held the main body of the 51st Division, 5,954 men, and the equipment the army had loaded across all 6 hulls with the specific intention of distributing the risk. If one ship went down, the division would lose that fraction of its total strength, but would not lose the entirety of any single unit's combat equipment. The planning for the distribution was careful and specific. The planners at Rabaul understood that ships were going to be lost. They made their plans accordingly, and they made them in a way that optimized for the continuation of the mission, regardless of which ships the Americans managed to hit. The air below the transport decks was thick with the heat that accumulates when hundreds of men are packed into spaces designed for cargo, and with the smell of oil from the machinery and the cigarette smoke of men who were not allowed on deck at night, and with the sound of engines that vibrated through the hull plates at a frequency that men would learn to distinguish from changes in engine power that meant something was happening. The soldiers of the 51st Division had been promised they were sailing to hold a position that Japan needed to hold. Most of them believed this. The men who sent them believed it too. What both groups understood, in different degrees of specificity, was that the convoy had already been seen. Japanese radio operators at Rabaul had intercepted the transmission from the American B-24 Liberator that had spotted the convoy on the afternoon of March 1st through a break in the clouds. The convoy was known. It was going anyway, because the alternative was to leave LAE to the Australians who were advancing from Wau and to abandon New Guinea to a collapse that the Japanese High Command had decided was unacceptable. Kimura set his course for the south coast of New Britain, where storm fronts sometimes provided cover from Allied reconnaissance. For 36 hours, the weather cooperated. The clouds that had protected the convoy on March 1st held through the darkness and the early morning of March 2nd. Then they broke. This is the story of what the Japanese lost in the Bismarck Sea in the first days of March 1943, and what the losing of it meant. It is the story of the 51st Division and of Rear Admiral Kimura, who sailed a convoy that he knew would be attacked because the orders said the position had to be held. Of Lieutenant General Adachi, who needed the men on those ships to hold a line that Japan's strategy in the Southwest Pacific depended on, and who survived the battle and had to report what had happened to it. Of the soldiers below decks who had been told they were going to fight and who were instead killed in the holds of ships destroyed before they could reach the land. And of what the combined fleet's own staff officers said about it after the war, that the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was the biggest cause of the loss of New Guinea, and that New Guinea was the beginning of the collapse that followed everything else. Not a single naval engagement among many, the one that opened the door. If you have never heard of the 51st Division or the convoy that carried it, subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments below. This channel finds the stories that were decided before anyone famous arrived. The stories where the outcome was determined by what someone did or failed to do in circumstances that are not in the popular histories. Tell us where you are watching from, because this community spans every continent and we read every comment. Write your city, then stay with us, because the story begins not with the attack, but with the decision to sail. To understand why Japan sent the convoy despite knowing it would be attacked, you need to understand the position that Japan was in by February 1943 in New Guinea. And you need to understand it as Japanese commanders understood it at the time, rather than as historians understand it now. The strategic reversal that Guadalcanal represented was visible to everyone in the Japanese military hierarchy by early 1943. The evacuation of Guadalcanal in February had been a withdrawal dressed as a tactical repositioning in the official communications, but the men who planned it and the men who read the intelligence reports knew what it was. The strategic initiative in the Solomon Islands had passed to the Allies. What remained of Japan's offensive position in the Southwest Pacific was concentrated in New Guinea, and the central point of that position was the base complex at LAE and Salamaua on the northeastern coast. LAE was not incidental. LAE was the anchor of the Japanese position in New Guinea, the base through which air power could be projected across the Huon Peninsula toward the Allied positions in Papua, the harbor through which supplies could be routed to the inland positions that Japanese forces needed to hold against the Australian units advancing from the south. The airfields at LAE supported the Zero fighters that were the primary Japanese air defense in the theater. The harbor at LAE received the supplies and reinforcements that sustained the garrisons at Salamaua and in the Huon Peninsula. Without LAE, Japanese forces in the region would have no base of operations that was not 300 miles further from where the fighting was happening. The Japanese 18th Army, which held the New Guinea positions under Lieutenant General Adachi, was already at the margin of what it could sustain. Malaria rates in Japanese forward positions were high enough that entire units were effectively combat ineffective before they encountered Allied ground forces. The medical supplies that combat in New Guinea required, quinine, dressings, surgical equipment, were being consumed at rates that the supply chain from Rabaul could not replace through the small boat and submarine routes that were the only alternatives to the convoy. Men who were sick could not fight regardless of their willingness. Men who were running out of ammunition could not hold positions regardless of their training. Without reinforcement, LAE would fall. Without LAE, the Japanese position in New Guinea would begin the contraction toward Madang and Wewak that would eventually be impossible to arrest. Lieutenant General Adachi understood this precisely. The 51st Division was in Rabaul because it had been scheduled to go to Wewak, a position further west, but the situation at LAE had deteriorated enough that headquarters redirected it. The men who were going to hold the line at LAE were the men now packed below the decks of the transports in Kimura's convoy. There was no 2nd 51st Division, there was no alternative convoy. There was what had been assembled, and the calculation that 50% losses were acceptable because the alternative was certain failure. The Japanese 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul assigned approximately 100 Zero fighters to provide air cover for the convoy throughout the voyage. Admiral Kusaka's planners understood that Allied reconnaissance would spot the convoy and that Allied bombers would attack it. The fighter cover was designed to engage and degrade those attacks before they could be pressed to close range. The Zero was an exceptional aircraft in the role that Japanese doctrine assigned to it: the interception of high-altitude bombers at medium altitude, the destruction of torpedo aircraft before they reached release range. The doctrine that produced the fighter cover assignment was built around the attacks that Japanese experience said American air power conducted. It was not built around what was about to happen. At 10 in the morning on March 2nd, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses found the convoy through clearing skies above the Vitiaz Strait and began the first attack. High-altitude bombing against maneuvering ships had a hit rate that Japanese naval officers had assessed correctly. It was low, manageable, the kind of attack that convoys had been surviving for more than a year. The B-17s dropped from altitude. Most of the bombs missed ships that had ample time to maneuver, but one transport was not able to maneuver quickly enough. The Kyokusei Maru, carrying approximately 950 troops of the 51st Division, took a bomb hit and began to sink. The destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo moved alongside and pulled approximately 900 survivors off the stricken transport before she went down. General Nakano, the division commander, was among the men transferred. Yukikaze and Asagumo took the survivors and drove at maximum speed for LAE, disembarking them before their equipment was gone, and their combat value was reduced to what men with rifles could carry. Then they turned around and came back to rejoin Kimura's convoy in the early morning of March 3rd. The convoy had lost one ship on March 2nd. 7 transports were still afloat. More than 5,000 troops were still aboard. The system that had been designed to accept the loss of individual ships and continue was functioning as planned. Kimura held his course. On the morning of March 3rd, as the convoy entered the Huon Gulf approximately 80 miles from LAE, the sun came up on clear skies and he could see the destination through binoculars. The math of 50% losses had so far cost one transport and roughly 50 men. The rest were intact. The soldiers below decks had survived one day of attack and were going to reach New Guinea. The convoy was going to make it. Then the radar operators on the escort destroyers reported aircraft contacts approaching at medium altitude from the south. Kimura ordered his gun crews to their stations. He recognized the profile. B-17s and B-25s at approximately 7,000 feet, the kind of attack that Japanese anti-aircraft training had been built around, the kind of attack that required concentrated fire and evasive maneuvering, and the patience to let the attack happen at predictable angles and predictable speeds. The convoy's defensive formation was correct. The guns were manned. The Zero fighters assigned from LAE's airfield were overhead. Kimura had seen this before. He had the anti-aircraft umbrella that Japanese doctrine described, concentrated fire from 8 destroyers and the deck guns of 8 transports, a wall of steel that experience said no formation of bombers had penetrated without unacceptable losses. He had everything Japanese naval doctrine said he needed. He was watching the wrong sky. The soldiers in the transport holds heard the anti-aircraft guns begin firing. The sound of a ship's anti-aircraft battery firing at high angle, the sharp, rapid report of 25mm cannons and the heavier beat of the 5-inch dual-purpose guns had a distinct quality that veterans had described in the accounts that circulated in training units. Men who had been in convoy operations before recognized the sound and knew what it meant. Men who had not recognized it from training exercises, from the drills that ship captains ran to prepare their passengers for the expected sequence of events. The guns were firing at aircraft above them. The convoy's defenses were working as designed. This was the manageable kind of attack. Then the character of the sounds changed. 13 Beaufighter aircraft from the Royal Australian Air Force's No. 30 Squadron were approaching from the southwest at approximately 50 feet above the water. They were below the horizon of every radar and lookout in the formation, flying between the surface and the visual horizon line, generating spray trails from their propellers on the sea, visible to no one aboard any ship in the convoy, because every eye in the convoy was elevated toward the medium-altitude aircraft that every man aboard recognized and knew how to respond to. The Beaufighters carried 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns each. Behind them, 12 B-25 Mitchells of the 3rd Attack Group were dropping from altitude to wave-top height 2 miles from the outer screen of destroyers. The B-25s had been modified with 4 50-caliber machine guns in the nose and 4 more in external positions, 8 forward-firing heavy machine guns aimed by pointing the aircraft. The attack that was about to reach Kimura's convoy was not the kind of attack that Japanese doctrine had been built to survive. It was the kind that had been built specifically to defeat that doctrine, designed in a Brisbane workshop by an American with salvaged guns and a wrench and a direct personal interest in winning the war before his family died in an internment camp in Manila. The Beaufighters reached the outer edge of the convoy's destroyer screen and opened fire. Their 20mm cannons began destroying anti-aircraft positions and killing gun crews on the destroyers before those destroyers' elevated guns could be depressed to the angle required to engage an aircraft arriving horizontally at sea level. The sounds that reached the soldiers below the transport decks were not the sounds they had prepared for. The sounds they had prepared for were the sounds of bombs falling from altitude. The distant whistle and the concussive impact and the water columns that high-altitude bombing produced. The sounds that came through the hull plates on March 3, 1943, were the sound of something arriving at the waterline, the hammering of machine gun fire at close range on metal surfaces that were not designed to absorb it, and the immediate absence of the voices of men who had been at their positions on the decks above them 30 seconds before. Men below decks who tried to reach the companionways to understand what was happening found them blocked by men coming down from the deck, trying to get away from what was happening above. Canberra's flagship Shirayuki was the first destroyer targeted in the main B-25 attack. Major John Hennebury's B-25 opened fire with all 8 forward guns at approximately 1,500 yards. The rounds arrived on the Shirayuki's bridge before anyone in the bridge watch had completed the response to the threat they had only just identified. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds at 2,900 feet per second through a bridge structure, built to resist weather and blast fragmentation, not direct machine gun fire at this angle and this rate. The bridge crew was killed. 2 500-pound skip bombs bounced once across the surface and drove into the Shirayuki's hull below the waterline, where the delay-fused explosions broke the destroyer's back. Kimura was not on his bridge when the bombs hit. The accounts of the attack suggest he survived, which means he was elsewhere in the ship or transferred the flag before the mortal hits landed, but the ship that wore his flag was dead. The Shirayuki sank. Her masts went last, rotating slowly as the bow went down, and then the sea closed over the ship that had led the 51st Division out of Rabaul 3 days before. The attack lasted approximately 45 minutes across multiple waves, though the concentrated main assault on March 3rd felt, to the men who survived it aboard the transports, like something that unfolded in a continuous roar rather than in the sequenced waves that the operational records describe. The Arashio attempted to maneuver between the attacking aircraft and the transports, placing her hull between the guns and the ships carrying the division's soldiers. It was an act of pure seamanship. The captain understood what he was doing and did it anyway, because the orders to protect the convoy were the orders he had, and the instinct to place his warship between the attackers and the transports was the correct instinct for the doctrine under which he commanded. 3 B-25s concentrated their fire on the Arashio simultaneously. Her bridge was destroyed. Her rudder jammed hard to starboard. The Arashio, out of control, drove into the transport Nojima. Both ships locked together and burned. The destroyer Tokitsukaze, carrying Lieutenant General Adachi aboard, was hit and sunk. Adachi survived, pulled from the water by one of the remaining destroyers. The transport Teiyo Maru was struck by skip bombs that opened her hull from below the waterline. The transport Oigawa Maru, the transport Taimei Maru, the transport Ayomaru. One after another, the ships that had carried the 51st Division from Rabaul toward the battle they had been promised came apart under attacks that lasted 8 seconds each and produced damage that no ship in the formation could survive. The convoy commander on the surviving destroyer, who reported the situation to Kimura after the attack, did not have a phrase that captured what had happened that was consistent with any training the Japanese Navy had provided. The anti-aircraft umbrella had not been defeated by bombers that broke through it at altitude. The umbrella had been rendered irrelevant because it was pointed in the wrong direction. The Beaufighters and B-25s had arrived below the minimum elevation of every heavy anti-aircraft gun in the formation. By the time gun crews who were not already dead understood that the threat was at sea level rather than at 7,000 feet, the attacking aircraft had already closed to the range where the 8-second pass began, and 8 seconds at that rate of fire was more than enough to end the conversation. The captain of one of the surviving destroyers wrote in his damage report that the attack method was one for which no defensive response was available given the armament and training of the convoy's escort. He was correct. The correct defensive response to the attack would have been to not be there, and the men who had ordered the convoy to sail had already decided that not being there was worse than the alternative. Below decks on the transports in the last minutes, there was very little that the soldiers of the 51st Division could do. The compartments below the waterline had no exit that led anywhere useful. The companionways to the deck led into whatever was happening on the deck, which the men below could only interpret through the sounds reaching them through the hull, the strafing fire, the explosions, the grinding impact of skip bombs detonating below the waterline, the inrush of water as the hull opened. Some men reached the deck and went into the sea. Some men on the deck were killed by the strafing that preceded the bombs. Some men in the holds were trapped as the ships went down quickly, too quickly for the flooding to be outrun by men in full combat equipment, rifles and packs and ammunition that had been stored below with them, weight that would drag men down in flooding that was faster than swimming. The 51st Division's equipment was distributed across all 8 hulls so that no single sinking would be catastrophic. In practice, this meant that the soldiers who survived the sinking of their ship arrived in the water with their rifles and their packs and the weight of everything the army had packed them with for the battle they were supposed to fight. By the afternoon of March 3rd, 8 Japanese transports were sinking or sunk. Their burning hulls marked positions across 60 miles of the Bismarck Sea, fuel and oil spreading from the wreckage and catching fire on the surface. 4 of Kimura's 8 destroyers were also gone: the Shirayuki, the Arashio, the Tokitsukaze, and the Asashio. The 4 surviving destroyers had their superstructures perforated with 50 caliber holes, and their bridge crews reduced to the men who had been below the direct line of fire. Yukikaze and Asagumo, the 2 destroyers that had saved 900 men from the Kyokusei Maru on March 2nd and delivered General Nakano to LAE and returned, now worked through the wreckage field picking up whoever was still alive. The water was thick with debris and oil and floating men. The oil fires made approach difficult in some areas. Some men had already been in the water for hours by the time the rescue began. Some men who reached rafts or wreckage were alive and signaling. Yukikaze and Asagumo worked through the night, making multiple passes through a debris field that was spread across an area too large to cover completely. The men in the water faced conditions that reduced survival to something more elemental than anything that training exercises had approximated. The Bismarck Sea is warm, tropical warm, the kind of temperature that does not kill by hypothermia in the first hours the way the North Atlantic would have. But warm water does not prevent drowning, and heavy combat equipment drags downward whether the water is warm or cold. Oil on the surface burns when it ignites, and the fires from the stricken ship spread burning fuel across sections of the wreckage field. Men who could swim could not always swim in the direction they needed to go because the burning oil was between them and the clear water. Men who found pieces of wreckage to hold onto found that some pieces were not buoyant enough to support them. Men who found rafts found that some rafts had already been taken past their capacity. The accounts from men who survived do not describe the experience in terms that translate well to the language used in official military histories, because the official language of military history was built to organize and classify outcomes rather than to describe the immediate experience of men in burning tropical water who could hear the voices of the men around them going quiet one by one. What happened on March 4th and 5th is the hardest part of this story to describe without losing the capacity to describe anything else accurately. Allied aircraft were ordered to search the waters around the wreckage for Japanese lifeboats and rafts and to strafe them. The official justification given by Allied commanders at the time was strategic. Men recovered from the wreckage who reached New Guinea would be rearmed and returned to the front, and the objective of the March 3rd attack had been to prevent the 51st Division from reinforcing LAE. Leaving survivors to be rescued by Japanese submarines and destroyers working in the area would, in the Allied command's calculation, partially undo what the attack had accomplished. The order was given. The aircraft flew. They strafed rafts and men in the water across the debris field of what had been the 51st Division's convoy. Some men in the water dove and survived, some did not. The Allied aircrew who flew those missions, men who had performed extraordinary feats of skill and courage on March 3rd, later described what they did on March 4th and 5th in terms that indicated they understood the weight of it. The Australian War Memorial records that the strafing of survivors caused long-lasting trauma for many of the aircrew involved. The order was from headquarters. The men who flew it lived with it. War crimes investigations after the war examined the episode. Historians have been examining it ever since. What the record says happened is what the record says happened. The submarine I-17 arrived in the debris field on the night of March 3rd and 4th and put approximately 150 survivors aboard. The submarine I-26 found another 54 survivors the following day and put them ashore at LAE. Individual groups of men from the sinking transports made their way to nearby islands in whatever they had found to float on. 18 survivors landed on Kiriwina Island, where they were captured by an American PT boat crew. Another group made it, by accounts that compress extraordinary hardship into the phrase "made it," all the way to Guadalcanal, only to be killed by an American patrol when they arrived. The surviving destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo departed the area after dark on March 3rd, packed with approximately 2,700 survivors who were returned to Rabaul. They were alive, but they were not at LAE and they did not have their equipment, and the 51st Division as a combat formation capable of reinforcing the New Guinea garrison was gone. Subscribe before we go further. Research at this level, primary sources, Japanese and Allied operational records, detailed accounts of what happened on both sides of this engagement, takes time that this channel depends on the people watching to support. One click on subscribe and your city in the comments. Just tell us you're here, that is the entire cost. Then come back for the final accounting. The numbers that the wreckage produced, assembled across the 3 days of the engagement and the subsequent accounting by both sides, were as follows. Of the 6,900 soldiers and sailors who had sailed from Rabaul on February 28th, approximately 3,664 were killed in the battle and its immediate aftermath. Approximately 2,700 were returned to Rabaul alive by the surviving destroyers. Approximately 1,200 eventually reached LAE, arriving by the various routes that Japanese logistics improvised after March 3rd. Submarines, small coastal vessels, the overland approaches through the jungle and mountains that the Japanese army used through the remainder of the New Guinea campaign, because the surface convoy route was no longer available. The division's equipment, the artillery, the ammunition, the medical supplies, the food stores, the signals gear that had been loaded across 8 hulls at Rabaul was on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Men without equipment cannot hold a line. LAE fell to Australian ground forces in September 1943. What Admiral Yamamoto received from the battle report was not a number but a conclusion. The conclusion was that Japan could no longer conduct surface convoy operations in the Bismarck Sea under Allied air cover of the type the 5th Air Force was now operating. It was a conclusion that, followed to its logical end, meant that Japan could not resupply or reinforce any garrison in the Southwest Pacific that was within range of American modified medium bombers, which was every garrison the New Guinea campaign depended on. The strategic map had not shifted. The strategic map had broken. A combined fleet staff officer, interviewed after the war, stated directly, "This defeat was the biggest cause of the loss of New Guinea. Not one cause among several. The biggest cause." The 45 minutes of attack on March 3rd, 1943 had produced an outcome whose consequences extended through every subsequent engagement in the theatre. Kimura survived the battle. His flagship was gone, his formation was destroyed, and 3,600 of the men he had been ordered to deliver to New Guinea were dead. He transferred his flag to another destroyer and continued to exercise command over what remained of his force through the night of March 3rd, directing the rescue operations that Yukikaze and Asagumo were conducting in the debris field. He had sailed with the understanding that 50% losses were expected and accepted, and he had lost a convoy that was not measured in percentage points, but in 8 transports and 4 destroyers, and more than 3,000 men who had not reached where they were going. He had been given orders that said LAE had to be held and that acceptable losses were 50%. The losses were substantially worse than 50%, and LAE would fall anyway. The convoy had been detected before it sailed, attacked on its first full day at sea, and destroyed on its second. There was no decision available to Kimura that would have changed the outcome of the fundamental problem, which was that the Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific had built a weapon for which Japanese naval doctrine had no answer, and the convoys that Japanese strategy required had no defense against it. The orders had been correct by the logic that produced them. The logic that produced them was broken by what happened on March 3rd, and it was broken in a way that could not be repaired by subsequent orders. Lieutenant General Adachi spent the next 2 years fighting the New Guinea campaign with the resources that remained after the Bismarck Sea. He commanded Japanese forces through the retreat from LAE, which fell to Australian ground forces in September 1943, through the fighting in the Huon Peninsula, through the operations at Hollandia and Aitape, through engagements that Japanese forces fought without adequate food, without adequate ammunition, without the medical supplies that had been loaded on the Teiyo Maru and the Oigawa Maru and the Ayo Maru and the other transports that were on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The New Guinea campaign after March 1943 was a campaign fought by an army that had been denied the reinforcement it needed at the moment when reinforcement might have held the line. Every subsequent engagement was fought by men who were fewer, sicker, shorter of supplies, and further from Rabaul than they would have been if the convoy had gotten through. The replacement logistics that Japanese forces in New Guinea depended on after March 3rd were the improvised routes that planners had already identified as inadequate, submarines that could carry a fraction of the tonnage that transports could move, small coastal vessels working at night to avoid Allied air cover, overland routes through jungle and mountains that killed men from disease and starvation at rates comparable to direct combat losses. The Japanese Army's own records from the New Guinea campaign in the second half of 1943 document starvation deaths, deaths from malaria and scrub typhus, and tropical diseases that adequate medical supplies could have prevented, deaths from wounds that could have been treated if there had been enough surgical equipment and dressings and antibiotics at the forward aid stations. These were not combat deaths in the direct sense. They were the deaths that follow the loss of a supply chain. They were what the Bismarck Sea produced in the months after the wreckage stopped burning. The soldiers who died in the jungle southwest of LAE in August 1943 were not killed by the B-25s that had sunk the convoy in March. They were killed by the conditions that the loss of the convoy created, conditions that would not have existed if Kimura's formation had delivered what it was carrying. Adachi surrendered in September 1945 and subsequently stood before a military tribunal on war crimes charges related to atrocities committed by his command in New Guinea. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in Sugamo prison in 1947. His 18th Army, which had needed the 51st Division to hold the line that the convoy was carrying it to hold, fought on without that reinforcement through 2 more years of a campaign that the loss of New Guinea would prove impossible to reverse. The soldiers who died under his command in the jungle and the mountains of New Guinea after March 3, 1943, died in the campaign that the Battle of the Bismarck Sea had already decided, whether those soldiers or their commanders had understood that yet or not. The soldiers of the 51st Division, who survived and eventually reached LAE, the fewer than 1,200 who completed the voyage by submarine and night boat and jungle track that the convoy had been supposed to make by direct route, arrived without their equipment and were incorporated into a defensive position that was already being compressed by Allied pressure from the south. The soldiers who had been below the decks of the transports on March 3rd, in the compartments where the army had stored the rifles and the ammunition and the medical supplies and the food that a division needs to function as a division, survived or did not survive based on whether the flooding was faster than the hatch they were trying to reach, and whether the oil fires were between them and the clear water, and whether there was anything to hold on to in the debris field when they reached the surface, and whether what they had managed to hold on to was still floating when the Allied aircraft returned on March 4th to search the wreckage. Most of them did not reach New Guinea. The ones who did found a garrison that was dying of everything the ships they had been on were supposed to prevent. The Combined Fleet Staff Officer, who said after the war that the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was the biggest cause of the loss of New Guinea, was describing a chain of consequences that is not hard to trace from March 3, 1943, to the evacuation of LAE in September of the same year, to the eventual collapse of the Japanese position in New Guinea that followed it, to the strategic consequences that the collapse of that position produced. The chain is not complicated. It begins with 45 minutes of attack on a convoy that had been designed to withstand 50% losses and encountered a form of attack it had not been designed for. It ends, in the broadest sense, with Japan's contraction toward the home islands that the loss of New Guinea forced. The 51st Division was supposed to prevent the first link in that chain. The weather cleared on March 2nd. The B-24 spotted the convoy. The B-17s came first. Then the Beaufighters and the B-25s arrived below the horizon, and the anti-aircraft umbrella that had protected Japanese convoys for 2 years was pointed in the wrong direction. Drop your city in the comments right now. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us if your family was connected to this part of the Pacific War, if someone served in New Guinea, or sailed with the 5th Air Force, or was part of the Australian units that fought up the Huon Peninsula after the convoy was destroyed. Tell us if you knew this story before today, or what part of it changed what you thought you knew. This community is global, and we read everything. Tell us you're here, because the men who sailed from Rabaul on February 28th deserve to have someone know what happened to them and why, and every comment is evidence that someone does.